shadow, like morning dreams, they just disappear, like dust in your hand, falling to the floor. Well, how can life ever be the same? 'Cause my heart is broken in pieces. Yes, my heart is broken in pieces since I lost you. It's all too easy to take so much for granted, but it's also hard to find the words to say. Like a castle in the sand, the water takes away. Now how can life ever be the same? 'Cause my heart is broken in pieces. Yes, my heart is broken in pieces since I lost you. Oh, now you never.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Rebellious Counselor Live. And it is Wednesday evening, and I can never remember the date, but it's Wednesday evening, and happy Wednesday to everybody, and welcome to the Rebellious Counselor Live with a rebellious look on grief tonight. And that was a song by Phil Collins, and it's called Since I've Lost You, where he's talking about the pain of grief. And unfortunately, the pain of grief is something that we're all going to experience at some point in life if we haven't already. It's part of life. It's the most natural thing. It's the most natural, actually, feeling that every human being on the planet will share in at one point or the other. So while lots of other emotions exist out there, we all sort of experience them differently, and with grief as well. But there's no escaping losing someone that you love. And whether that is through death and loss, or whether it is through the end of a relationship by choice or because somebody leaves you, or it could be the loss of really anything that is important to you, can leave that feeling of grief and that sort of empty place. And why now? Why tonight? Why are we doing a show on grief when, certainly I've done so many shows on grief? Why tonight? And tonight, as I've been talking about all week on my Facebook and Instagram videos, the American Psychological Association, who contributes to our diagnostic manual, decided to add a new diagnosis under bereavement to prolonged grief. And this actually made big news. And you might be wondering, why? Because psychology and counseling are not usually news making. It's not usually a news making field, yet I totally it should be. It's not generally a news making field, but it's made the news because, again, grief is something that we all have either gone through or will go through. It's part of life, no matter where in the world you live. And saying that adding a new diagnosis for prolonged grief after a period of 6 months is really shocking to a lot of us mental health counselors, grief counselors, psychologists, etc., because we know as mental health professionals that grief is not something that only lasts for 6 months. And in fact, I would argue that grief is something that maybe doesn't even hit us until maybe a year after that person has died. And yes, the first year is, foggy and full of anxiety and sadness, but grief is a very long process that I would argue never really ends. It only changes. It changes form and it changes shape and it changes experience with time. And I've seen people grieve, 6 years after somebody dies, 25 years, 35 years, 2 years, 5 years, and everything in between. So there isn't a right number. There isn't a right time that you should feel grief. And I really don't understand, why they're adding more pathology to bereavement and grief, because that in turn makes all of us feel worse by having deep, intense feelings of sadness 6 months plus, which is basically an absolute. So now it's a new way that to frame grief or feelings of intense sadness or anxiety 6 months and after, when it used to be, I think, 2 years used to be the period that if you were still feeling, intense grief after 2 years of losing somebody, that, you could be diagnosed with a bereavement diagnosis. Not that any diagnoses even really matter, but putting it out to the public that, hey, if you're still feeling a loss after 6 months, there's something wrong with you, and we can diagnose you and we can get your insurance to cover some new treatments. And some of the treatments that they're talking about are all, pharmaceutical treatments. And, in my opinion, aren't going to do a whole hell of a lot for someone with a broken heart, right? Because when we lose someone that we love, our heart breaks. And we feel it. We feel the pain in our physical bodies. We feel it in our emotional bodies. And to feel something emotionally, you wind up feeling it physically, and that's how you can kind of know that you're feeling pain. So I want to address this tonight, and I want to talk about some of the basics of grief and what to expect. And from my point of view, what is, if there's such a thing as healthy grieving, what does that look like? And how do you know if what you're going through is normal? And, how do you know if indeed your grief is just, I don't know, perpetuating and perpetuating past a time frame of which you feel comfortable? And what do you do with that? And I can't tell you how many clients I've worked with over the years who, maybe lost a parent or a spouse or a child and never went to therapy. Years passed and the dysfunction became so heavy and so outrageous and so difficult to deal with that then they came into therapy. So would I ever take any of those people and slap a diagnosis? Oh, you're diagnosed with prolonged grief? Absolutely not. So once again, we have to move away from pathologizing what's so natural, the grieving process. And I feel very, very passionately about this because grief is a specialty of mine and something very near and dear to my heart, and something that I'm very passionate about, and passionate about helping people through. And anyone who knows me, who's been my client, knows that this is really, a special place for me, a special area of concentration in the counseling field. So what is grief? Let's just talk about what grief is. I always like to define things so we're all on the same page for what we're talking about. So grief, by my definition, is basically the deep emotion and sense of sadness over the loss, sadness specifically over the loss of another person that we were close to. And while we can grieve other things like finances, lifestyle, buildings, homes, cars, those things, I think register differently emotionally, and they can always be, you know, they can be replaced, right? But people and our relationships cannot ever be replaced, not ever. So we have to understand that when we're talking about grief, we're talking about a deep sense of loss. And we're also referring to not just an emotion, but I think the period of mourning, right? The grief period, the period over which we feel this intense, deep sadness over the loss of a loved one. And I would say people and pets are really what, in my mind, qualify for this deep sense of grief that we're talking about tonight. And again, I can do other shows on losing other things that can be traumatizing in life, but for purposes of tonight's show, we're really focusing on the loss of people because nothing hurts more than losing people. And in fact, we all try so hard to avoid the pain of grief, the emotion of grief, that we will stay in relationships that make us miserable, that hurt, just to avoid that sense of loss. Or so we think we're avoiding the sense of loss. So even if it's a really tumultuous relationship that does not bring us joy, but we feel a connection to another person, we become so afraid of being alone or losing a connection with another human being that we may allow them to stick around just to avoid that pain. We may find ourselves keeping our loved ones alive in certain end of life situations when there's no hope and the person is very uncomfortable because we don't want to have to deal with the pain of actually losing that person. And I could go on and on. We will avoid it. We will drink ourselves. We will drug ourselves. We will eat ourselves. We will starve ourselves. Anything to distract ourselves from the human experience of grief. And I believe very much that the depression that comes connected with grief and loss, believe it or not, this is a very rebellious view I'm about to put out there, but that depression that we sometimes sit in for long periods of time is actually a comfort to us. So even when we're grieving and we're mourning, we may hold on to our depression, our feelings of depression and grief, because we believe subconsciously or perhaps consciously that that's the only way that we can stay connected to this person or this pet that we lost. And so think about that for a moment. So all of these very intense and sad emotions that go along with the grief cycle and with mourning, they're very they serve a lot of different purposes. Some are very protective, right? Sometimes we might pretend like it's not happening. Sometimes we just I have a lot of friends that lost parents during COVID, and my male friends in particular just went right back to work like that day or the next day. That's very common with men. Women will more likely, stick around, make the plans, handle all the stuff that goes along with somebody dying, right? So there's so many things that happen in the mourning process and the grief process, and everyone handles it differently. But if there's one thing that I please, if there's one message that comes out of tonight, don't pathologize yourself if you're still feeling grief 20 years later. And I candidly talk all the time about the loss of my parents. And both of my parents were deceased by the time I was 37, 36. My father died when I was 11, and my mother died when I was 36, I believe, or 37. I can't really remember. And I still grieve for both of my parents all the time. Does that mean that I'm not functioning? Obviously not. Does it mean that I'm not enjoying life and getting out there and having fun and doing, wonderful things in my life and with other people? No, of course it doesn't. But I still grieve. We still feel that unexpressed love, that grief is this deep unexpressed love that we kind of feel. It feels trapped and it feels vacuous, and we start to feel like there's something missing, and we don't really have the capability of seeing life without this person. We cannot imagine laughing or smiling without this person. And it's important to know that this is totally acceptable and normal and healthy. So no matter what diagnostic book or what any medical doctor will tell you, talk to us grief counselors who really get into the grief with our clients, that understand the grief process. And any of us will tell you that grief never ends. It only becomes less intense. It doesn't go away forever. You don't get over somebody dying. You just don't. You don't. It doesn't happen. The love and the relationship and the connection that we share with people is the legacy of that person in our lives. It reminds us of how this person touched us, what they taught us, how they changed our lives. And so we don't really have the opportunity to just say, oh, okay, I'm over it. Does not happen. Does not happen. So we understand grief is this deep sense of loss and sadness. It's a pit in your stomach. It's a concern for the future, not really being able to see how you'll ever go on without this person. And often we also can't understand or accept the circumstances, excuse me, of somebody's death. So, for example, when we hear of a very young child dying, or when we hear, of a young person dying, or someone that we just think is so wonderful and deserves the gift of life, and they have that taken away from them in an instant, or they die suffering, it's hard for us to wrap our heads around that and to accept that. We don't want to accept that life can be this painful or this cruel. And so we sometimes get kind of caught up in that aspect of the loss as well. So aside from the loss that we feel as an individual, we may also grieve over just the death itself, this deep, profound sadness that, a child died from cancer, or that our loved one, was killed in a car accident or something sudden. And there's two very different types of grief that we understand in thanatology and grief counseling. And we understand that there's standard grief and there's something called complicated grief. And this is very important to understand if you are grieving or you're close to somebody who's grieving. What's the difference? Well, standard grief is the grief that comes from somebody who was very sick for a period of time, and we slowly, over a period of time, understood that, okay, this person's going to die. So, for example, my mother was diagnosed with lung cancer. I don't remember what year it was, but she lived with lung cancer for 7 years. So I knew that most likely at some point she was not going to live as long as I had hoped. I knew that she wasn't going to be around for, into her 80s or even her 70s. I kind of figured that. You always hope, but, you figure it. And standard grief, you watch, you see the decline of somebody, maybe they have a disease or something. And so from being close to them, you are in a way part of that process. So you see them declining, you see them getting sicker, you see that their body's breaking down, they're getting weak. And on some level, I mean, we can never fully accept this, but on some level, we do know inside, okay, this person's probably not going to make it. So when they do finally die, it's not a complete shock. It's something that on some level we've prepared for, maybe even if it's just intellectually, we've prepared intellectually, we knew it was coming. That's what we consider standard grief. And then we have something called complicated grief. Complicated grief is when somebody dies unexpectedly or suddenly. So examples of that could be car accidents, surgeries, and people die in surgery. They go in for a routine back surgery and then they die. You weren't expecting that. Accidents, car accidents, surgeries, murders. I mean, just the most awful, shocking things that you can think of that take the life of somebody that we love, that we were not expecting whatsoever. is called complicated grief. And it's complicated because the shock of that person not being there anymore is so sudden, so overwhelming, so outside of um your expectations that you can't even digest it. It doesn't even compute. And there's all kinds of really severe psychological things that can happen when we lose somebody very suddenly. And so it becomes complicated, hence the name complicated grief. So we have the standard grief and we have complicated grief. And I think that even in standard grief, when we see somebody sort of declining over a period of time, we still, when the final, breath is taken, there's still some sort of disbelief that, wow, okay, this person's really not, it's final, right? They're gone, because finality is something that I think human beings in some ways are not set up to process at all. So, final meaning no more, never again, never, ever, ever again. Will you see this person? Will you talk to them? Will you touch them? Will you feel their energy? Even when it's expected, is a very hard pill to swallow. And when it happens unexpectedly because of an accident or some kind of sudden occurrence, your body isn't, your brain, your emotional system, your body is in such shock that it could take you years to really fully digest the loss of this person. And our bodies go into such a state of stress and a state of shock, chemically and physically, that we literally do not know what we're doing. And I find it very common when I am talking to someone about a death of a loved one. If we go back to that period, I often hear, well, I don't know, it was fuzzy. I can't really remember what happened that first year. I don't remember the funeral. Or I might hear the opposite from people who experienced a death maybe 20, 30 years ago. And it is so fresh that they remember like it was yesterday. I could tell you the details as I remember them of my father's death, which was like 35 years ago. I could tell you what I was wearing, where I was, what time it was, everything that happened that day, because it made such an impression in my mind. And in all these years and all the things that happened, I could tell you line by line what happened. And I know that people who are watching this are nodding there and going, yep, me too. I've had so many conversations with people, even just this week, about loved ones that have been gone for 30 years, 20 years. And it really just feels like they were just here yesterday, right? Because the sense of time is sort of irrelevant when you love somebody, right? It doesn't change your feelings about that person who died. So it doesn't matter if they've been gone for 6 months, like the DSM is going to start listing, or 30 years. You can't really put a sense of time on love, and you can't put a sense of time on an emotional connection that you have with another, especially someone that was so close to you, that was maybe a lover, your spouse, your parents. It's very hard to really accept and process that person is not there any longer. And our brain does really funny things to us when we're grieving. I can remember having blocks of time when my mother passed away, that I would just not remember, and I would go and redo things or retell the same story to my friends and not remember that I had just talked to them an hour ago, because I was in such an emotional state that I was sort of disassociated or disconnected from the world around me. And what many grieving people will tell you, or they'll come into my office and they'll say, Elizabeth, I don't feel like I'm the same. I don't feel like this is really happening. I feel like this is a dream. I feel like this is a nightmare. I feel like this is something that didn't really happen. And that's really sort of when we disassociate from our emotional system because we can't process it all. So we can all look back on those significant losses that we've had, whether they're complicated or standard, and we might be like, I don't know what I was thinking. I blew $30,000 in a year on handbags, or I drank 2 bottles of wine every night, or I smoke so much pot, because not only are we naturally in shock and disconnected and disassociated from our emotional system when we lose somebody, but we also will find ways of escaping that pain. And we will do anything to avoid feeling those feelings of loss. And when I say anything, I mean anything. I've heard it all. Okay. And it's all okay, because losing someone is painful, and there really is not an easy way out of it. And there isn't a time frame that any counselor can say to you, okay, in 3 months, you're going to be good to go. I mean, 3 years, you're going to be good to go. We don't know. We don't know that. And I have seen, particularly when there's loss of a child, when I'm working with parents who have lost a young child, that grief process is very long. So the real heavy feelings of profound sadness, they can go on for a good 5-6 years before the parent feels like they can re-enter and reconnect with people. And that's with therapy. So a lot of people don't go to therapy, and their grief process becomes really, really unbearable. And if you're watching someone you love going through that grief process, you often feel very helpless. You think, well, what can I do? How can I help this person through this? And truthfully, there isn't a lot you can do except hold their hand and be there with them in their pain, and never try to push somebody out of it. That was one of the first things I learned when I worked at the Children's Bereavement Center of Miami, that you never say, get over it. In fact, I think we could be, asked to leave if we said something like that. I mean, it was really serious. So we understand that the grief process looks really different for everybody, but yet, there are some commonalities that, I've definitely seen over the years, that I've experienced myself, being extremely forgetful, and being, I would say, fragile. And I think in the early stages in particular, maybe the first couple years, we're extremely fragile. We will react emotionally to certain triggers that will remind us of that person. It could be a song, it could be a TV show, it could be something that we're used to doing with them, and we can't go near that area. So, some people can never want to go back to the hospital where that person died, or any hospital at all triggers them. They may not want to go back to the neighborhood or drive down the street where that person used to live, or, I mean, there's anything that could trigger the memory. We will become very sensitive to, and we might not want to expose ourselves to that trigger. We may avoid anything that triggers. We may not want to talk about it. And that's another reason why we never want to diagnose somebody at 6 months' time with anything, because unless they want it, if they want to be diagnosed and that helps you, then that's great. But, it could be years until you're even ready to talk about losing that person. You may never talk about it. I had a client in here this week that had lost a member of her family, 25 years ago, and never talked about it until they walked into my office. And so, I see all of this frequently. So it's just part of this intense pain. And again, I don't think there's a more painful emotion than grief and loss that exists. And I think that that's why a lot of counselors don't even want to deal with grief or death and dying. I mean, I think there's a taboo about in our society about talking about death and dying anyway. It's like, well, let's not talk about it when it's the most, natural guaranteed thing that, well, we all share. We better not talk about it, right? Better not talk about that. And that's too bad because we deny ourselves, an opportunity to really process and become comfortable-ish with the subject that we're all going to face. So it's a shame that there is such that taboo about it in our society. And obviously I'm very comfortable about talking about death and loss and dying, but I've been trained in some ways for that, but I've also lived it. So once you live it enough times and you experience it enough times, and you are a clinician where you're working with people who are grieving, you start to become more and more comfortable with it. And when you become comfortable as a clinician, your clients become comfortable too. So it's very important, even that clinicians, if any other therapists or psychologists are watching, if you feel uncomfortable talking about death, go see someone about it that isn't, because we cannot bring comfort to our clients or to others if we're not comfortable talking about the subject ourselves. So all of these symptoms are normal that I'm talking about. You may also experience a lot of physical ailments when somebody dies. So when you look back on the year that mom died, or the year that dad died, or the year that your wife or your husband or your child died, you're going to look back and see that you were at the doctor a bunch of times, that you were on antibiotics, that you were experiencing intense physical pain. Your back went out, so your neck went out, you broke your arm, you can't use your hand, you're breaking out, you gained a lot of weight or lost a lot of weight. A lot of the grief sits with us in our physical body, and it manifests into a lot of physical issues. And we know this to be true because we know for a fact that stress, or living in a stressful state, when our stress hormones are pumping, which is what happens when somebody dies or we're going through a lot of traumatic experiences, we know that the immune system breaks down. And when the immune system breaks down, all kinds of crazy things happen to our bodies. I've known people who've lost their hair when somebody has died. You name it, it can happen. So give yourself a break the first, I'd say, 3 years after a serious loss, and be patient with yourself and be patient with others. And of course, I do believe in therapy, but I also believe that it's got to be the right therapy for grief. And don't think that just any therapist is out there is really prepared or really capable of dealing with grief, especially if it's complicated, right? Especially if it's sudden, or it's from an accident, a drug overdose, something like that. And know that if you're experiencing something like that right now, or you're in like the first 6 months to a year period of losing somebody, you're not thinking straight. And you won't realize that until years down the line. I look back on the year my mother died, and I mean the year my grandparents, or whatever, and you make stupid decisions. You don't remember a lot. Things seem very hazy, and you might get very physically sick, and it's going to be kind of blurry. And so I'm just saying that because I want you to just understand that's natural, that's okay. And be patient with yourself. Be patient with yourself. So we've spent all this time talking about grief and what it is and how long it can last and what it feels like. But of course, the big question is, what can we do about it? How can we climb out of this dark place, this heavy place where we feel sad and we feel hopeless and we feel that we, can't face the future, or we don't want to face the future without this person. how do we reintegrate ourselves into society, and when should we do that, and how should we do it? First, let me say that if our government would ever give a bereavement program to the citizens of this country, I would think it was the best idea, because I think everyone should have a couple of months off when somebody dies. And oh, I'm sure people are up and off when I say that. But I really believe that if you have a significant loss, you need a couple months to get your shit together. Okay. And I'm not saying that you should, you know, totally isolate yourself, but if that's what you feel like you need to do, then I'm all for that. But I think we all could use a couple of months to spend more time with family, to have less pressures. Um, and, we should also try to stay connected to our other relationships that are surround, but it would be really nice if we could get some time off. Now, we all know that that's not realistic and it's probably never going to happen. But if it were up to me, I would find a way to make sure that everyone could take a couple months off and get paid for it if somebody died. But I'm a dreamer, and who knows, maybe one day I'll lobby for it, but not right now. So, what do we do about it? How do we repair, and how do we deal with something like this? And there's no cookie cutter answer for this. I can't give you an exact formula, but I do think it starts with being very patient with yourself, understanding you're going to be forgetful. You're not going to be on top of your game. People are going to get mad at you because you forgot this or you forgot that. Or they might be upset with you because you don't want to go out anywhere and you're not going to parties, or you're not going to family affairs, you're not going out with your friends, or maybe all you're doing is going out, right? You're some extreme behaviors. And you want to be careful of those things, but you want to also understand that that's part of the process. For kids, when they're grieving, a lot of times their grades will drop, their behavior will change. They will maybe start getting in trouble a lot, start, experimenting with drugs or alcohol. And like teenage grief, that could be like a whole separate show, because it is kind of its own animal. But those are some things that, I would say expect or anticipate. I think therapy is wonderful. I think that, if you feel like therapy, is going to just, diagnose you or make you feel like something's wrong with you, just keep searching for the right person, and maybe look for someone who specializes in grief, or talk to people in your community, talk to your rabbis, talk to your pastors, your religious leaders, and see if they have anyone they can recommend, and get yourself into therapy. Because when we're missing somebody and we're grieving, what we really want to do is we want to be close to them again. We want to connect with them. We want to feel like they're still here, and that they're not gone forever, and that we will see them again. And in order to do that in a way that is, I don't know, in a way that is, I would say, productive, we need to stay connected to the memory of that person. And there's many ways of doing that. There's so many different techniques that we can use as counselors to keep people connected. Something that my therapist did with me when I was a teenager, when my father died, that I really loved, I do with a lot of my clients. And I remember she asked me to bring in pictures of my dad, or of me and my dad together. And I brought the pictures in and I told the stories about each picture. And it was really wonderful because she made me realize that I could still be connected to him even though he wasn't here. And so I do that with all of my clients, bring in pictures or memories or things that, really remind you of this person or make you feel close to this person, and bring them into me, and let's spend the whole session just talking about this person. And I love doing that. And I love learning about my clients, you know, the people that were really important in their lives that are no longer here in the physical sense. So those are just some ideas of some of the things that we can do in therapy. Sometimes, depending on the situation, I have people rewrite a eulogy and we do it together, and we have our own little memorial service or our own little funeral, or we come up with different ideas of things that we can do with our families that keep us connected to that person's personality and what that person brought to their lives. And we talk a lot about what that person has, how that person has affected and impacted your life. And I think that can be also so meaningful when we're dealing with loss. And I've told this story before, but I'm going to tell it again. When I was in graduate school, my mother died when I was in the middle of my doctoral studies. And my professor called to give me condolences. And he said, Elizabeth, I'm really sorry to hear about your mom. I said, thank you. And he said, remember, death is the gift most often unopened. Michael White said that. And Michael White is a theorist in the therapy world. So it wouldn't mean anything to most of you, but he was an important person to me. And so my professor said, death is a gift most often unopened. And I got really angry. Didn't tell him I was angry, but inside I thought, well, what kind of thing is that to say to a person whose mother just died 3 days ago? What kind of thing is that to say? But I went along with it. But I remember feeling angry that he said that. And it wasn't until about, I don't know, a few months later that I started to understand what he meant. And the way that I understood that was as I was cleaning out my mother's things and I was going through her old photographs and her clothes and, really in the thick of my grief process, I started to learn things about my mother that I didn't know when she was alive. And I talked to her friends and I got to hear stories about my mother in her other role, not just as my mom and my, closest confidant, but also as a woman and a friend to other people. And that was a gift to me. And I started to understand that we can use the grieving process, we can use the mourning process to expand our love and our awareness of this person and the impact that they really had on our lives and how meaningful that they really were, not just in our lives, but to many others and to the world. So I think that it's very critical that we do think about things in that way. And these are all just ideas therapeutically of how we can keep you connected to the person who died when obviously they're not here in the physical. Something else that, of course, I believe in, I believe very much in life after death. And, if people are interested in that aspect, I can bring that into our therapy. Some people don't want anything to do with it. Some people love it. So I let my clients determine whether they want to bring that aspect into therapy or not. Personally, on a personal level, huge believer in it. And I believe that we can remain in contact with people who have died. And I had a medium on who's my friend, Katie, a few weeks back, and she talked about how she actually really does connect with people who have passed away. And she is, pretty amazing. And through my sessions with her, I have come to understand, and a lot of training with her, that there absolutely is life beyond the physical. Now, even if you can make contact with that person, or you believe in making contact with that person, they're still not going to be in your life, right? You still can't go out to dinner with them. You still can't go out to lunch with them. You can't go shopping. You can't watch a movie with them per se, right? That physical being is not coming back. It is not there. And you're not going to see that aspect again. But we can connect with I guess you could say, the essence of that person or the energy of that person, in a way that we can look for signs that they're there. Um, we can ask, gee, what would my mom tell me to do in this situation? Or what would my father tell me? Or what would my husband tell me? Or my boyfriends, or, whatever. And you can just imagine it. Or you can really seek out somebody who can truly connect to people on the other side. Again, if that's something that you're open to and you're interested in. And that has brought such a huge, beautiful, piece to my grief counseling that I couldn't even put it into words, because a lot of us carry around the sense of loss that's so intense and so difficult to understand and live with, that it's not until we can make that connection that we feel like we can start to let go of some of that pain and move on. Because when somebody dies, we worry, right? Where did they go? Are they okay? Where are they? Do they see me? Can I ever see them again? Will they see me, giving birth to my first child? Or will they be there when my daughter graduates from high school? Or will they be there when, I do this show tonight? We want to know, right? And especially young children, when they experience death of a parent, they're very concerned with, where is my mom? Where is my dad? Where is grandma? And that is something that's very difficult to answer. And so sometimes, if we do sort of travel into other aspects of life and death, that we can sometimes come up with some really profound information and some really profound answers to that. So, if that's something that you believe in, or that you're even curious about, read, watch videos, investigate, and see if you can discover your own connection to that person, or find somebody who can help you do that, because that can be very life changing and can bring a real sense of peace and help you repair along your grief process. So, while I love that piece and I believe in it, not everybody does. So, and I understand that it's not for everybody, but if it's something that you're open to, I would encourage you to explore at your own pace, to see what you might be able to be, what you might find, or what you might be connected to. So there's a lot of different ways that we can work to get through the grief process, that we can try to cope with the sadness. We do not have to be pathologized with a diagnosis and a code in order to get better. If it makes you feel better, you can go for it. A lot of people will ask me, how do I know if the way that I'm grieving is healthy? How do I know that? And I think that only you know that. I don't think there's, again, I don't think there's a formula for that. I think it's good to consult a therapist. I think if you're finding that after a couple years, that you are, just sort of obsessing over your pain, or you have, I guess, sort of enshrined, something we call enshrinement in grief therapy is when you sort of go all out to keep that person alive, in a sense. Like, people literally build shrines all over their homes and, whatnot, to that person. That can get a little bit sticky and unhealthy, but it just depends. So I think that you always want to ask, am I functioning at the level of which I would like to? And if the answer is no, I'm not functioning at the level that I would like to, then I think there's your barometer as to whether or not this is a healthy process for you or not. And I think most of us will find that the answer is going to be no when it comes to grief. So even more why I encourage people to reach out for help, so we can, reflect back to the person who's grieving, where they're at in their process and where they might want to think about going. So we always have the question, We always have to question ourselves. Am I functioning at the level of which I would like to? Not my mom or my dad or my child or my grandparents or my teacher. Am I functioning where I want to be right now? That's the question. And I think that once we can figure that out, then we can decide, whether we need help. Am I functioning? Am I um, am I being productive? Are my relationships intact? Is my home intact? Am I taking care of the things I need to? And if the answer is no, then I think, that's when you want to say, okay, I might need some help, or something is not processing here because I'm not functioning, right? And I think that's the basic question to ask. And most of us will know, no, I'm not functioning and I need help. I need to go to therapy. Some of us will not know that. We will bury ourselves in our work or our kids or whatever. And that's how we keep it moving. So, to that point, to that end, I don't know what time it is. I could talk about grief all night, but I think it's time for us to wrap it up. So, if anybody has any questions, I'm going to try and check the Facebook to see if anyone's written anything. And I did just get a message about somebody's asking if my loved one. This is a hard question. If my loved one just passed away, what do I do? If they just pass away suddenly, what do I do? And, this is really, really difficult. It's really difficult to answer, but I'm going to do my best. So I think if you're early on in the stages of loss, you need to go really slowly, because you're going to feel like you're here and the rest of the world's over here churning away, and you're not going to be able to feel like you can connect to the world. So it's going to be a very weird feeling of sort of disassociation, and you're going to almost feel like you were hit by a Mack truck. And the first several weeks, there's so much chaos that goes on between funeral arrangements, talking to family, getting finances in order, dealing with your kids if you have them, that it's really a blurry time. So I think you want to really remind yourself, if you're in the throes of this, in the early weeks of a sudden death, that you really want to go slow and take things step by step. Just ask yourself the simple questions. Am I eating? Am I sleeping? Do I have food on the table? And, can I pay my bills? And if the answer is yes to all those things, that's good enough. So start really, really slow, and just really, really patient, and just ask yourself, okay, my husband, my wife, whatever, just died a couple weeks ago. And I've had all this chaos and funeral arrangements and finances and this and that. Just take each day as it comes, and just try to meet the basics of life. Am I eating? Am I taking a shower? Am I able to pay my bills and take care of my very basic responsibilities? And that's enough. That's all you have to worry about in the beginning. If it's a sudden loss, you might want to seek help immediately with a grief counselor, just to assess if you're handling things okay, if you're able to maintain some sense of stability. And if you're not, then you might want to entertain some ideas about medication, just for a little while, just to sort of just to take the edge off. Because even though you're in this deep sense of loss and you're feeling very disassociated from the rest of the world is still moving. And somehow we have to keep up with the basic needs that we have, and the basic needs of our child and our children And so it's a very difficult time. The best piece of advice I could give somebody who's just in the early throes of a sudden loss is to ask for help. Ask for your family to help you out, whether it's picking up the kids, helping feed the kids, bathe the kids, whatever your needs may be, um, ask for help. And, there's a lot of traditions in the communities that we live in where, people in the neighborhoods will check on you. They will bring you food. They will bring you dinner. Because the last thing you want to worry about is, cooking for yourself and your kid, and because you're just so emotionally drained. Make sure you're sleeping. That's a challenge when you're in the early throes of a sudden loss. So again, that's why I say if you're there, it doesn't hurt to consult with a grief counselor or with a doctor, and just make sure that you're doing the basics to be able to manage your children in your household. Ask for help. Be patient with yourself, and pace yourself. A lot of times in the beginning, people, they want to rush and get that person's things cleaned out of the house and just throw everything away, because they can't stand to look at them because the stuff is too painful. Some people want to keep it for years. I don't think there's necessarily a right or wrong, but think about what your needs are, not other people's needs. Think about what your needs are. Think about what your immediate family's needs are, and don't try and do everything at one time. Just go slow, take your time. You have time to get the clothes cleaned out or organized or this or that. Unless you just want them out so badly, then go ahead and do it right away if it's making you anxious. But, in a year, remember, you're going to be looking back and you don't want to make any decisions you're going to regret. So recognize that you're not completely yourself. Let your family know that you need help. Let your friends know you need help. And let your friends and family know that, hey, I'm not going to be myself for a while, so be patient with me. Don't push me. Respect me if I don't want to go somewhere. Keep a check on me and make sure that I'm okay. Make sure that I am functioning at the most basic level. And I think that if you're really in the throes of early grief, especially when it's sudden and it's accidental and you're just in complete shock, that the slower you move and the more conscious you can be in your decision making, the better off you're going to be. If you have somebody in the family that you trust, be very careful who you trust. But if you have someone in your family or a professional who can help you with the finances, just getting things organized, or with the legal aspects, if you're dealing with any of that, ask for help. But make sure that the person that you're asking has your best interests at hand, because you hear all kinds of horrible things happening to people in their most vulnerable moments. So make sure that you speak to somebody reputable, or you ask help from a family member that for sure is looking out for your best interests and can help you with some of those basic things that you need to take care of. And I think that that's really the best off the cuff advice I can give somebody. Breathe. Remember to breathe, because sometimes when we're grieving and we're in that state of shock, our breath becomes shallow, our stress hormones are pumping, and we forget to just eat and breathe and sleep. So if you can get those things in order, you're in good shape. And look for help, ask for help, reach out to your community. Don't try to get through it yourself, because you can't. You need support from somebody. So I hope that was helpful. And if anyone's watching who is in the early throes of a loss, or it's been 20 years and you're still wrestling with some issues or some feelings of loss or grief, call me. Would love to work with you. It doesn't have to be something that you come every week. It might be something that you do once a month. to just check in and try to process that loss. Just to, kind of ease your soul about what happened and make sense and accept. Because again, when we're talking about grief and loss and death, there is no time. Time is a lie. It's just a sort of a concept, but it doesn't actually exist, because our love is our love is our love. Our connection with people is our connection, and that never dies. Love never dies. So if you're grieving and it's been 10 years, or it's been 15 years, or it's been 2 months, you're going to grieve, because grief is love, right? Grief is the unexpressed love that we have that we can no longer share with that person. So we don't know what to do with that. And so it turns inward and becomes this heavy sadness. So try to stay connected to the person who's passed away in whatever way you feel comfortable with. I'm here. You can reach out and always consult with me. I feel very confident in my competence in this particular area, and I can definitely help put you in touch with the right people. And that's really the best that we can do in the early stages, or even in the late stages. So if you happen to come across an article in the next couple weeks about, the American Psychological Association is going to diagnose you if you have prolonged grief, which means 6 months or less, ignore it. It's total BS. There's got to be something behind it financially, some financial gain for something that they can charge, or, do something with insurance, because it's just unacceptable to me to expect somebody to not be grieving at 6 months. On the flip side, if it makes you feel better to call yourself something with a label and say, hey, I'm having prolonged grief, then go ahead and do it, but it's either way. There is no right or wrong way to grieve, and there is no time frame that I can honestly say to you that I would feel would be appropriate, because it's just so different for everybody, and it's different depending on how old you are when it happens, what's going on in your life when it happens. There's just a million things that will create the grief experience for you specifically. So if you need to reach out to me, I am available by going to my Facebook page, or by going to my Instagram or my YouTube, which are all listed on this post. Very easy to track down. Not so easy to get on the phone, but I'm easy to find. And if you need help, reach out and I'll be here for you. You've been watching Be Rebellious Counselor live, talking about grief every Wednesday night at 8:00. We're here talking about something mental health or relationship related. Thank you all so much for watching. I love chatting with everybody every Wednesday night at 8:00 and giving you a rebellious look at mental health and relationship issues. Dare to change. Until next week.